Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new semester of AP Government and Politics. This year, we are going to be diving into all sorts of stuff about the US government, how it's set up, its structures, why it was set up that way, and I think most importantly, how we can engage with our government and be part of an active and engaged citizenry. So, today we're going to kick off with what I'd say is sort of an overview of constitutional principles and values, shared values of American political culture, in some of those structural pieces as well. So, this is sort of an overview chapter. We'll dive into everything we're covering today more specifically as we move through the rest of the semester. At the top of your note guide today, you are going to find your learning targets for this unit. And I've tried to include some of the vocabulary that College Board is going to use when they test you and they ask you to do certain things. And so you'll see here, there's a few different topics that you need to be able to describe, right? Which is to define and then tell me a little bit more about it, provide me with examples and non-examples, right? We'll be working on comparison, a lot of comparison of data, comparison of different types of systems, so on and so forth. And then finally, explanation, more of that long winded, giving a claim, describing the evidence, connecting your reasoning, that sort of stuff. So some of that higher level thinking. So today in this chapter, we're going to focus on sort of the stories of our nation and how some of these exemplars that I'm going to provide to you today demonstrate some of the core values of our democracy. We'll connect to some founding documents. We're going to cover a variety of them throughout the semester. And into the spring as well, looking at founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, the principles of the U.S. Constitution, things like rights, consent of the governed, limited government or limited power, so on and so forth. And then finally, we'll look at different models of democracy, and how they're implemented and where they're implemented in our system. And finally, sort of a overview of how the US government balances order and freedom, right? Or liberty. And look at that tension and how that tension impacts politics. Now, political science or government, studying government in general, can sometimes feel abstract. And so I think sharing stories helps make those concepts that we're going to cover more testable. It shows how real institutions impact our rights. It shows power in practice. And so we have a new AP Gov textbook, and it's really focused on storytelling. And I think that makes it an easier read. I think it makes it stick a little bit better. And we can probably all think about times, whether it be in real life, in politics and news coverage that you see, or whether it be in the storytelling that happens in a novel or a movie, where people disagreed about what was right. And they had a lot of discussions and they practiced and engaged in politics as a way to settle conflict. So I have a question for you guys on your note sheet that asks you to think about a movie, a TV show, a book, a real life event where people disagreed about what was right. And then think about what values were in conflict in that scenario, right? Was someone's freedom at stake? Was someone's equality being threatened? Their security, law and order, right? And was the decision settled, right? As you're thinking about that, I think it's important to note that these sorts of things happen every day in public policy and the world around us, right? If we consider something like elections, you think of the Harris versus Trump election in 2024 and think about their very different views on something like immigration policy, right? Or education policy. If we think about immigration, we can think about how many of these values may be at stake, right? How someone's freedom or equality might be at stake. But the purpose of cracking down on immigration policy might be increased security and order, right? Those sorts of values conflict, and that has an influence on the policy that governs our nation. So, stories often have messy outcomes because these values conflict all the time. And so they help us understand experiences and apply the information that we're going to learn throughout the course this year, right? The other thing that we're going to focus on it as far as AP Gov is not only how is the issue solved, but who solves it? Is it ever solved, right? So we'll look at the institutions that have a role, our court system, our public schools, our system of elections, our legislatures, right? All of those different things will be covered throughout the course of the unit. I've mentioned a few issues where, I said Trump versus Harris might disagree on an issue like immigration. I'm going to ask you to pause the video and take a minute to identify 3 to 4 issues that are present in the United States today, right? And for a description or definition for you here, it says an issue is a real or apparent conflict between the interests, the ideas, or the beliefs of different citizens. So based off that definition, can you come up with 3 or 4 of those? And then looking at the list that you come up with, do you think those issues have changed significantly since colonial times or since the founding? We're going to focus on the founding in chapter 2. And to what degree, why or why not, sort of practice some of that explanation in that question. Now, we have lots of issues, right? We can think about things like immigration, healthcare, the economy, civil rights, social issues, all sorts of different things. And some of them have maybe changed quite significantly. Some of them, I think the broader categories to some degree are kind of the same, right? At the founding, they were still talking about immigration and citizenship. They were still talking about healthcare, but they weren't maybe necessarily talking about universal healthcare. They might have been talking about, long gone diseases that we no longer deal with, right? It wasn't COVID, but it might have been smallpox, those sorts of things. And so, how do we solve those things? And that process of solving or agitating issues is called politics. Okay. And politics can be done in a variety of different ways. I've sort of listed out on your note sheet some activities that are political in nature. I think it's worth noting that politics happen in government, but they also happen in our everyday lives. We engage in politics. Okay. This could be at your dinner table with your family. It could be a discussion with your friends, right? And so some sort of go-to activities that can be political in nature are going to be things like negotiation, right? Where we're each bringing ideas to the table and we have this give and take. Argument, I think of more in not like yelling at the dinner table, more like formal argument is how our resources are going to define it. This might be more reserved for office holders, things like a floor speech in the US Senate, where you're kind of laying out your points, right? You don't necessarily know that floor speech is going to gain you votes. The hope is always that, but lots of times it's just putting your argument out there, right? I would say discussion is how most of us engage. We're talking with our friends, we're talking with our coworkers, we're talking about the news of the day, right? Application of force hopefully doesn't happen all that often in a free democratic government. But I think of force when it comes to things like money, right? Force could look more like the influence of money. Um, I helped fund your campaign. Now there's this bill before you that deals with an issue that's important to me. I gave you money. Can you give me a vote? Right? And then persuasion. Persuasion is more so a political strategy to influence the public, to influence public opinion and shift policy, and gain some support, right? Now, politics and government are deeply intertwined, but they are different, right? Government is the institution. It's the rules, it's the bodies that make and enforce policy. It's Congress, the presidency, the courts, bureaucracy. It's federalism, that is state governments, and the national government. So politics is part of government. It's how government acts in many ways. But when we're talking government, we're talking the institutions themselves. Now, can you have politics without democratic government? Yeah. I mean, you other forms of government do have politics. But if we want to have a government that represents the people, politics and government have to be very tightly connected in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be in non-democratic institutions, right? Authoritarian institutions, for example, right? So these concepts are really tightly connected. And the big sort of overarching question, the key distinction here is who gets what, how do they get it, when do they get it, and what institutions provides it. That's what politics is attempting to settle on about every issue, and it works through government systems. If there's one central theme to this chapter, it's liberty versus order. And how does that tension play out? Where does it play out? How should it play out? Right? And we're going to use public schools as an example because there's a lot of great examples of how public schools attempt to balance the freedoms and liberties of students while providing order to the school day. And public schools present a unique predicament in that they are government institutions. And as government institutions, they must retain to some degree some constitutional rights for their students and their staff. And so you have some space to sort of define liberty and order, right? And list some examples of the balance between those two. When it comes to liberty or freedom, I would say they're synonymous. This is a general desire for personal rights, for freedom, and we'll talk about how we maybe define freedom differently depending on our own concepts and political beliefs. But that is, you think the United States, you oftentimes associate it with words like freedom and liberty. So we'll be talking more about that. Then we think of order as sort of security or safety, right? That societies need safety, rules, you name it, for social stability. Otherwise, you'd have chaos, you'd have anarchy. And so when we're thinking about public schools and how these rights and responsibilities of governments must be balanced, right? We might be talking about something like student speech. Student speech is an essential freedom or liberty, but you can imagine that if students could say whatever they want, whenever they want, that would certainly threaten the order and stability of the school's functioning, that it might make it hard for certain students to, or maybe many students, to learn and to experience the benefits of schooling. Now, many times conflicts are not right versus wrong necessarily. It's not like one party is always right, the other one's always wrong. It's how do we reach this balance, right? And in which way? I would say most of the time, the government institution that's going to be most involved is going to be our court system. It deals with those claims about constitutional rights and sort of helps us set the bar for when schools can intervene, for when other government institutions can intervene as well. Right. Another one I often think of when it comes to this balance are things like hot button issues like gun rights. That's a liberty versus order piece, right? You could tie in abortion as a liberty versus order piece, right? So a lot of our issues today are about getting these two things to coexist and what that should look like. So, I'm going to briefly tell you a couple of stories that are covered in this chapter in the textbook that deal with student speech rights at school. So, the first one is going to be Addison Barnes. And Addison Barnes had worn a shirt that was political in nature. And the administration at the school had deemed his shirt as offensive and to other students, that sort of thing, that ultimately they provided a suspension. And you can see his shirt here, Border Wall Construction Company. The wall just got 10 feet taller. That's the shirt that was involved in the incident. And so ultimately, as a result of the suspension, Addison Barnes' family filed a lawsuit. They took legal action through the courts, arguing that Addison had First Amendment rights in public schools. And ultimately, in his case, they ended up settling. He got some money from the school district and a public apology, which shows how individuals can use the legal system to assert their rights. This wasn't ever a Supreme Court case. It doesn't get that far. It doesn't set a new nationwide standard, but is a great example of how a student and his family used the court system to settle a conflict that they believed was unjust, right? Now, in this case, public schools are government actors. They're always government actors and to some degree are bound by the First Amendment. And so that's what Addison Barnes is trying to challenge here, right? But we've also said students can't say whatever they want whenever they want. So the key question then becomes, well, when can a school restrict political speech without violating the Constitution? We're going to look at a variety of Supreme Court cases this year, 14 to be exact, one of which is Tinker versus Des Moines. And it's a landmark student speech case about students who protested the Vietnam War by wearing black armbands. Okay, it was symbolic to them of mourning the dead. And we'll look at some other cases. We're going to look at Brandy Levy's case in just a minute. But as we're looking at those cases, one of the most important skills for you to practice is the ability to identify the right. What part of the Constitution is involved here, or federal law? What's at stake? What's the right that we're seeking? In this case that we just talked about, that was a free speech issue, right? First Amendment free speech. Identify the actors involved, because the actors involved can change the outcome of the case, right? Had Addison Barnes got fired from his job for wearing his Border Wall t-shirt, the actor there is a private business. They don't have to uphold First Amendment rights. And so identifying the actors and the people involved and what sort of responsibility they have for upholding rights is an important step of the process as well. And then when it comes to our court cases, the form is always going to be the courts. They went to the courts, they filed litigation to get something solved. But that won't always be the case. It's not always the case that issues are solved. Sometimes issues are solved via public outcry, right? It's all over the news. The public gets involved. There's public protests about it, and policymakers choose to change the rules, right? Sometimes it is through Congress. Sometimes it's through state legislatures. Sometimes it is through city councils, right? I live in Horace, and so we let fireworks go off for like 2 weeks straight in around the 4th of July. And some citizens didn't like that, right? But there's not really an avenue to take that to the courts. The form in that case is to bring it to city council to see if the city ordinance can get changed, or to see if you can get it on the ballot for the city ordinance to get changed. So the form isn't always going to be the courts, but in court cases, that is the form. Now, I'm going to have you do the legwork on this case, which is about Brandy Levy. The scenario in this case is Brandy Levy had applied for the varsity cheerleading team at her school. And she was ultimately cut from varsity. She made the JV team, and she did not like it. As I imagine most of you can feel similarly if you were passionate about a team or a sport and you wanted to get on, right? And didn't. So she posted a vulgar message on her Snapchat that eventually the school was informed of, the coach was informed of. I won't tell you the full vulgar message because it includes some profanity, but she basically was mad at the school and the coach, right? And ultimately, the school suspended her from being on the cheer team. So she didn't make varsity, and now she's suspended from the JV team as well. Okay. Now, I want you to identify the right, identify the actors involved here. So, who are the people or institutions involved? You might say the coach, you might say the principals. More broadly, this is going to end up being a school district because the school district will represent their employees in these types of cases. Okay. And then the form. What avenue does she go through to resolve her case? This case is going to end up at the Supreme Court, and it's going to set sort of a bar for off-campus speech and how we approach that. Okay. The outcome in this case was actually 8-1 in Levy's favor. So the case at the Supreme Court level was called Mahoney Area School District versus BL. Okay, Brandy Levy. The Supreme Court rules 8-1 that public schools generally cannot punish students for off-campus speech. Schools should be viewed as sort of nurseries of democracy, but ultimately their authority ends at the schoolhouse gate. Now, not all off-campus speech is protected. For example, there's been cyberbullying cases where things have happened on social media outside of school and they get brought in. And that's still, to some degree, perfectly allowed, right? Threats and harassment remain viable, but expressing an unpopular opinion about the school or things of that nature, they are generally going to say the school has to be hands off, right? This is a different story if Brandy Levy curses out her coach at practice, curses out the administration when she's informed of her suspension, right? Those are all different things. This is about a Snapchat story. And here, the Supreme Court sort of draws a line and says off-campus speech is protected. One of the major reasons that the school district loses this case is because this legal doctrine that oftentimes schools rely on in presenting their cases was not really seen as viable by the justices in the Levy case. So, why do schools have some control over students? That is because of a legal doctrine called in loco parentis. And it defines some school authority over student speech and student conduct. It literally means students act in place of parents. We just like to use Latin terms in the court system. And so while students are on school grounds, your teachers, your administrators, kind of like your parents, right? They're expected to uphold your conduct and maintain order and stability and safety in the school day. In this case, the court doesn't buy that, right? Like the school isn't your parents all of the time. And so that means this legal doctrine cannot apply when it comes to off campus speech, right? And so that weakens their argument. And ultimately, there's some exceptions to that. But in the grand scheme of things, when it comes to off campus speech, students are going to be allowed much more expression than they are within the school building. So maybe a quick review of everyone's favorite amendment. The First Amendment is the right involved in Brandy Levy's case, specifically the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And so I think it's important to note what that actually protects and who from. The First Amendment restricts government actions that limit speech. That's why public schools matter, because they are government entities. This would be a whole different case in a private school, because a private school is not a government actor. And so constitutional free speech protections just don't apply in the same way. When it comes to issues of free speech, right? Maybe you've heard your classmates talk about like, well, so-and-so got canned from work because of X, Y, and Z. They were just speaking their mind, right? But we always need to think about some of these questions if we're wondering if the First Amendment applies, right? Who is restricting my speech? If it was your boss at a private company, that's not an issue, right? Most of the time. If it's my boss when I work at a public school, that might be an issue, right? So is the actor the government? If they're not, First Amendment doesn't apply as much. If they are, the First Amendment protects us from government actors. And then what was the justification for the limitation, right? Was it order? Was it safety? Was it disruption? Was it something viable or not, right? When it comes to public schools, the standard that's set in the Tinker case, which we'll talk more about later in the semester, is that the justification has to be a material and substantial disruption to the school day, right? Not something hypothetical, something material that is destructive to other students' learning. Now, the next part of this lesson is largely about some of the core ideas, or I often call them constitutional principles, that were discussed at the American founding. And of course, the founders were looking to design something where there was more involvement by the people, right? Rule by the people. And so that is a democracy, right? They're looking to create a democracy. Now, at the time, in 1787, when the Constitution is signed and written, democracies had been talked about as sort of an Enlightenment idea. They had been practiced many, many years ago in ancient Athens, right? And the Roman Republic would be a form of democracy as well. But we're sort of living in an age of monarchies at the time. And so trying a democracy again is sort of a revolutionary idea, right? Now, a democracy is an institutional arrangement where the government arrives at political decisions and acquires their power through that competitive struggle for votes. And the American system is shaped by a variety of things, right? The belief that any legitimate power needs consent. We sometimes call that consent of the governed, that you have to get my consent to act on my behalf. We do that through a system of elections. That there needs to be protection for rights, right? That natural rights existed before governments existed. And so the government's job is to protect our rights, not to inhibit them. And then there was a general fear of concentrated power. The founders knew that concentrated power would threaten liberty, that it could lead to tyranny. And so they created systems, institutional systems in our government to try and prevent that, right? This is going to be things like separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism to some degree as well. And so that this democracy was going to be very intentionally designed to support those things. Many of these ideas are laid out early in our first foundational document, which is the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is kind of four major parts, right? It's written by Thomas Jefferson, and the English kind of see it as a formal declaration of war, but it's really to us like a founding statement of political legitimacy, a statement of what we believe should happen when governments violate people's rights. And it's also has this focus on the right to revolt, the right to rebel, right? It asserts things like equality as a general principle that governments should uphold, right? Probably the most famous line in the Declaration of Independence is we find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain natural rights, right? The existence of rights doesn't come from government. It comes from a higher authority, right? A higher power. You might think of a god, if you will, right? And it should be the job of the government to protect those rights and derive their power from the consent of the governed, from us, the average people, right? It also kind of generally functions as a list of reasons we should separate from the British by listing some grievances. And so I think of it as four parts, right? You have a preamble, which is just like an introduction, and then you have Jefferson laying out his theory on government, right? What good governments should look like. If we're thinking of the Declaration of Independence as sort of a breakup letter, this is where you say, these are all the things that should happen in a good, loving relationship. And then we hop into the grievances. This is where you have gone wrong, right? This is all the bad things you've ever done to me, right? When you didn't text me back and you didn't do the dishes and you did X, Y, and Z, right? Those are grievances. And then it closes out with this Declaration of Independence, the breakup, right? Viewed as a declaration of war by the British. And so this founding document is in many ways, I would say, plagiarism of John Locke. John Locke was an Enlightenment thinker that talked about a lot of these things, and Jefferson puts them back on paper in the Declaration of Independence. He wants to use them in practice, right? And so in your notes sheet, you have sort of an organizer comparing the writings and philosophies of John Locke to the plain text of the Declaration of Independence. Many of these ideas of John Locke are repeated on this slide as well, but Jefferson talks about things like natural rights. He calls them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke had defined those as life, liberty, and property. Um, Social contract is the idea that governments are instituted amongst people who chose to give up their freedom in exchange for protection of their rights and security and order in society. And then the right to revolt, right? In the Declaration of Independence, they're talking about, or Jefferson is talking about, that when governments violate these rights, right? When they attempt to take away your rights, when they don't ask for your consent, that they have the right to be abolished. We ought to abolish them, right? One of our other Enlightenment thinkers that has a major influence on the founders is going to be Baron von Montesquieu. Montesquieu pitched this idea of separation of powers, that power should be divided amongst branches to prevent tyranny. And we designed the new US Constitution in 1787 in that way, right? That we would break the US Constitution and the government created under it into three separate branches. And even more so, with the legislative branch, they say it's important to divide it further because it is the biggest. It has the most power. Making laws is a major power, and so we're going to break it further into the Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. Right? We have the executive, who is the president. Their job is to enforce laws. Right? And the bureaucracy helps them do that. And then we have the judicial branch, which we've focused on a lot so far in this chapter, but ultimately their job is interpret the laws, interpret the meaning of the Constitution, the meaning of federal law, and attempt to solve some of these conflicts. Now, this creates inefficiencies. Dividing government creates inefficiencies. We know that, but that is not the goal. If the goal was efficiency first, think of how fast a bad actor could unravel government, right? And so the goal is liberty first. So we must slow down the power to prevent abuse. And that was Montesquieu's pitch, and we adopt that in the US Constitution. There's also constitutional principles like popular sovereignty, limited government, right? So I have some of those defined here as well, right? Sovereignty is authority to rule. Popular sovereignty is going to mean the people. The people rule. The government gets their power from us. Limited government is the idea that government is not all powerful. It's constrained. It only has certain powers and certain rights for us that have been transcribed in the Constitution. So the Constitution, its focus on we the people, right, really signals that ultimately the people are the source of authority in this system of government, even though it is governed through institutions that in many ways are powerful. When it comes to the type of democracy that our founders wanted to create, ultimately, there are two types. We do not go with a direct democracy, okay? Direct democracy, another word for it, is peer democracy. In a peer or direct democracy, citizens vote on policy, right? You and I vote on the tax bill. We vote on the healthcare bill, the farm bill, okay? You can imagine how quickly voting would get overwhelming, right? Traditionally, a direct democracy is associated with ancient Athens, where every citizen had a vote on policy. I put citizen in quotations because that meant you were a landowning male in ancient Athens, right? So it wasn't everybody. But peer democracies or direct democracies really are not all that practical when you go large scale. And so, what our founders decide on is a republic or a representative democracy, sometimes called an indirect democracy as well, where citizens are going to vote for elected officials who then vote for policy on their behalf. The Roman Republic is the first example of sort of a republican form of government, or a representative government. Now, why representative government? I said practicality, efficiency, right? But it also allows for specialization. People who are politicians who work on public policy, that is their job, right? They specialize. You and I don't need to be doing that all day, all the time, right? Um, it creates accountability. So I know who to blame if I don't like how a vote went, right? But there's also issues. There's issues like lack of responsiveness, right? Or factions in society, that is, different small groups that are competing against each other and creating chaos. There's the inequality of influence. I don't have as much influence on the government as Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, right? And so there are some issues where representative democracy, yes, great in theory. Does it always work? Not necessarily. I mentioned Locke and Jefferson's focus on inalienable rights, or natural rights. So I should provide a quick description of those for you before we move into talking more about liberty and some of the models of democracy. So inalienable rights are rights that are not supposed to be taken away from government because they are inherent. We are born with them. And so the American system of government, through all of these principles we've talked about, like a republican form of government, separation of powers, checks and balances, all of these different things, the system is attempting to protect rights, right? They do that through constitutional limitations, like the Bill of Rights says Congress may not, right? Separation of powers, checks and balances, as I mentioned. Federalism is an important element of upholding these. That push and pull between state and federal government ultimately helps protect our rights. You can see a lot of examples of that in a lot of public policy issues over abortion. Is a major federalism issue. We'll talk more about. And then ultimately, the courts that interpret these claims about rights, cases like Levy's case, Tinker's case, Addison Barnes' case, all of those things kind of work together to protect civil liberties through our institutions. So we started with liberty. We're going to kind of get to wrapping up on liberty as well. I mentioned that we might define liberty differently depending on our perspectives on government. And so I think there's kind of two major visions. And one is liberty means freedom from, and one is that liberty means freedom to, right? And so when we're thinking about freedom from, we're thinking about protection from government interference in our lives. This is sort of the classic civil liberties approach, the don't tread on me approach, right? That governments should be hands off. Governments should let me have access to my guns. Governments should let me smoke weed. Governments should let me, access an abortion, whatever it may be, right? You think of all those controversial issues. Many of them can be sorted into these camps. And I think a lot of those civil liberties type arguments really fit into that freedom from government control. Freedom, too, is more about the capacity to pursue your goals and to thrive, and that the government should help create an environment where that's possible, right? And so this is often linked to things like opportunity or conditions or support. That might look like a discussion we have about healthcare or welfare policy, right? Public education, access to education. All of those things sort of fit in that freedom to. How can my government help me live a life that gives me the freedom to pursue my goals and thrive? One other thing worth mentioning here is going to be that these conflict as well, right? These perspectives are going to conflict. One person's expression, their freedom of expression, may affect others' sense of safety, sense of order. Whether that is legit or not, it will conflict and people will feel that way, right? If we're looking at the example of schools, in schools, it's often the administrators who are arguing for order and structure, but it's usually the students who are arguing for expression, freedom from the tyranny of schools, right? And so that democracy requires balance, requires a lot of balance. Our final piece is about the different models of democracy. And ultimately, the question here is, where does political power actually come from? Where is it concentrated in the US system of government today? And there's a few theories about that. The first is participatory theory. And participatory theory says that democracy works best when as many people as possible are actively engaged. They're voting, they're community problem solving, they're organizing, they're engaged in civil society. So, active citizen engagement. A civil society group is going to be a volunteer group outside of politics that still helps build connections and build those civic habits, right? You might think of volunteering for your church or joining your PTO, right? Or something like that, where you're engaging in that community problem solving. There's many different examples beyond that, right? Thinking of things like recalls, which are essentially elections to unelect officials that you no longer give your consent to. Referendums are called like propositions in California and some other states, but this would be legislation that's already been passed by the legislature, but it's put on the ballot for approval, sometimes called like the people's veto. And then there's the initiative. Initiatives in North Dakota we call measures, and these are issues that are placed on the ballot by the people. Recently, there's been a initiated measure about school lunch, covering school lunch universally through the state budget. So that was brought not by policyholders or policymakers, but by regular people through the initiated measure. So that's participatory democracy. We should have power. We should be involved, right? Pluralist theory or pluralism is this idea that many groups are competing to attempt to influence government policy. These could be interest groups, they could be organizations, they could be those civil society groups that I mentioned. And the assumption is that when many single groups are competing, no single group will win all the time, right? So you think of something like healthcare policy. Well, there's going to be doctors, there's going to be nurses, there's going to be patients, there's going to be insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, all of these different groups that want to influence the process. And so ultimately, no single one of them is going to get everything that they want. So that's pluralism. There is a version of pluralism called hyperpluralism, which is listed as theory 4 on your note sheet, which is when so many groups are competing and they are so strong, they're like more powerful than the government itself, that the government is stagnant, it's unable to function. And so you might think of like big industries, say big oil, big pharma, some of these major groups with a lot of power and a lot of money that might make it hard for government to make sound decisions, right? As sort of a non-government example, I think of like grocery shopping with my kids, right? My kids are little and they want treats at the grocery store, right? But as their mom, I also have a responsibility to get good food that nourishes their tiny bodies, right? But it can be hard when I bring them to the store with me and they're like, I want this, right? I want treats, I want cereal, I want all these different things. It can get me off track, right? So if I'm the government, the kids are the powerful entities that are influencing government. That's sort of hyper pluralism. And then we have elite theory. Okay, an elite theory is sort of the idea that the government is made of the rich and powerful, by the rich and powerful, for the rich and powerful. And so it's dominated by a small group of people with wealth or status that have greater influence over policy. And that inequality of influence translates into political power. And that leaves like you and I having less power, right? Now, the US system aims to prevent that concentrated power, but things like money, organization, and access to government officials certainly do shape outcomes. And participation is unequal across the board. And so groups that are participating more can expect more responsiveness as well. And I would say this can happen in any form of government. It happens pretty severely in totalitarian and authoritarian governments. But it can happen here too, and you can maybe think of some examples of that. Other theory, the last one we haven't covered is bureaucratic theory, which is the idea that the real power is concentrated with appointed officials, not the people we elect, but think like cabinet secretaries, right? Um, so if we think of all those, secretary of war, secretary of education, that it's those people and the people that work for them that really have the most control over sort of our day to day, because Congress has delegated so much authority to them over time. So, to wrap up, I have a few questions I want you to kind of wrap your mind around. There's no correct answer. Just try and explain yourself. So, we're looking at how you think political power is actually distributed in America. What sort of values do you think are most important in American democracy? We listed a lot of them. We talked about those constitutional principles, but we also have talked about the balance of values like order and freedom and that sort of trade off. Equality, I've mentioned as well. So, which ones do you think are most important? And then finally, on the back page of your notes, you have a few final essential questions to think about. I want you to think about, from a student perspective, when do you think schools should be able to limit speech and why? Um, we already talked about which model of democracy best describes the US today. This one says use evidence. So I'm going to talk about how I want you to do that in a second. And then the final question is, how do some of these founding ideals show up in some modern conflicts over rights and order? Can you think of more modern examples? And as you're answering those questions, I want you to think sort of through an AP framework, right? And lots of times in AP, we're going to use sort of claim, evidence, reasoning as our way of outlining our answers, right? So you're going to open with a claim. That's going to be one sentence that directly answers the prompt and proposes a hypothesis, right? I believe the model of democracy that best describes the US today is blank. Then I'm providing some evidence. I'm providing the data, the quotes, the experimental observations, what I see in the world around me, right? That evidence that supports my claim. And then we tie it all together in what we would call the reasoning, right? This is the logic that explains how or why my evidence supports my claim. So if you can try and do that for at least one or two of these responses, it's great practice for the AP exam. And otherwise, that's a wrap on chapter 1. Take a look at the vocab. If there's any that you're unsure of, bring it back to me, and have a great rest of your day.